Is America doomed? Kurt Andersen will be here to discuss his new book, Evil Geniuses: The Unmaking of America, A Recent History. What's the story behind John Hersey's monumental book, Hiroshima? Lesley M.M. Blume will be here to talk about Fallout, the Hiroshima cover-up, and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's August 28th. I'm Pamela Paul. Kurt Andersen joins us now. He has a new book out. It's called Evil Geniuses: The Unmaking of America, A Recent History. Kurt, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right. So your previous book to this was Fantasyland, and I feel like there's a connection. So where did you leave off in that book and pick up in your new book?
There's definitely a connection. And they really amount to kind of a 2-volume history of the screwing up of America of the last half century. Fantasyland was about how this chronic condition in America of a weakness for the irrational and magical thinking and entertaining lies turned into this acute illness after having been a centuries-long chronic illness the last 50 years, and thus the President of the United States as the poster boy for that. And this is a different story. This is not a spontaneous or organic problem that I'm talking about here. It's about the paradigm shift and hijacking of our political economy that happened starting 50 years ago by what the people I call evil geniuses. It's this very rational, very specific, very strategic long war that had the effect in 100 different ways of making the majority of Americans worse off.
So if Fantasyland talked about America's propensity to believe in nonsensical, illogical things, it sounds like Evil Geniuses is kind of why the efforts that were made on the part of institutions and individuals that have led to that kind of thinking?
No, actually not that led to that kind of thinking. That it's a wholly different thing. What I have, having been a neoliberal, Clintonian, centrist Democrat all of my adult life, part of this book is a mea culpa for simply being oblivious to what the economic right was doing. So these evil geniuses are people of the economic right. You know, the Kochs are the most obvious buzzword way of saying that, and how they manipulated and used and changed through all of these different means the way we thought society and the economy should be since the New Deal. They used the fantasies and delusions and magical thinking and all that of their political allies on the right to enable their real project, which is to make Americans think that government has no role in anything involving the free market.
When you were working on Fantasyland, did you know that you were going to be writing this second kind of companion book?
I really didn't know that. And it was late in the game of working on Fantasyland where I realized, wait, I am kind of telling half the story here. There is this other story that isn't about, look at wacky America. We've always been wacky for 400 years and believed all kinds of nonsense. But I realized that there was this other story about how the economy changed and how politics changed and what technology is doing. That is the other half. And it really came when I was out talking about Fantasyland with people, readers, whatever. I remember early on, a woman at a reading stood up and said, well, what about climate change? Yes, it's a matter of nonsensical disregarding science and the facts, but it's all about people like the Koch brothers shifting the way people thought and denying science. And I said, yeah, it's that, but it wouldn't have happened to the extent it has in the United States without this underlying iffy grip on empirical reality. But I realized that it was both of those things. You know, people all over the world have iffy grips on empirical reality, but they don't have this massive politicized denial of climate change, for instance. It's the two working in concert in so many ways that has led us where we are.
Okay, I have two time-related questions. The first about the writing of the book and the second about the time that you cover in the book. And I'm getting very specific about the timing of the writing of the book because, as you know, things are moving so fast that the second you think that something is the big story, something else becomes the big story. And these are both kind of 2016, post-2016 books. Where did you pick up in writing this book? And also, when did you stop? Because, it probably, I'm assuming this was a pre Black Lives Matter, but maybe post COVID book, or am I getting that wrong?
First of all, Fantasyland, I wrote and finished before Donald Trump was even nominated. So it wasn't like, oh, look, Donald Trump, I'll reverse engineer how that happened over several hundred years. With this, I delivered it in early February, but then bless Random House had the next several months to incorporate, which is a significant incorporation because it reflects so much of what I'm talking about, the pandemic and the hellacious, horrific US government Trump administration response to the pandemic, which illustrates most really of my major themes in this book. So the whole last chapter is about that. And indeed, the Black Lives Matter protest also is in here as well, to the degree it relates to what I'm talking about. This is a book less about race than it is about economics and technology, but it's certainly all of a piece, and I address both. The pandemic thoroughly.
And it's also about culture in
For
relation
sure.
to economics. So you've mentioned that this is about the past 50 years. We're talking about something that you see as kind of beginning or shifting, or doing a cultural U-turn in the 1970s. What happened then?
Well, what happened culturally, and this is a subject that I've been thinking about for a while independently, and then over the last decade, I realized, wait, there are several interesting connecting points between the phenomena. What happened, I believe, in reaction to the late 1960s, which is to say the cultural 1960s, all of this kind of glut of the new and the shock of the new in not only race and gender norms, but cultural norms and the kind of ultra individualism and find your own truth and make your own bliss and all that. And just the general constant cultural newness and change every couple of years. I believe what happened, and it's pretty clear to me what happened, starting right after that in reaction in the early 70s, was this plunge into nostalgia, this wholesale plunge into nostalgia that didn't just last a few years to get over the crazy 60s. It abided, it kept going and kept going through the 70s, and was part of what enabled the Reaganite right to sell a majority of us this morning in America idea of, like, wouldn't it be nice if we were all like it was in the old days again? And look, Ronald Reagan kind of epitomizes the old days, doesn't he? And isn't he a nice guy? And so this general, like, unprecedented and unprecedentedly long plunge into cultural nostalgia, pop cultural and otherwise, enable this. Again, I'm not enough of a conspiracist to suggest that the evil geniuses created it, but they certainly used it really brilliantly. And then the other part of my cultural story is that after that 2-decade long plunge into nostalgia, another even weirder and more unprecedented thing happened in this country and beyond, which is this kind of cultural stasis where there's just less cultural change than there was certainly in my lifetime, but for more than a century, that things kind of stayed the same, and big radical cultural disruptions, apart from the technological ones, stopped happening as much. And I think that fits into what's going on here too, because it reinforces people's sense that big change just can't happen, doesn't happen, isn't going to happen. So I think that has reinforced the sense that what's the point of politics? What's the point? Nothing's going to change.
I want to go back before we get to our current hellish moment to the 1970s, because I'm interested in in what happened during that decade. Usually when I think about that period of nostalgia, and I'm assuming what the nostalgia is for is kind of that post-war, up through maybe the assassination of Kennedy kind of period of economic prosperity and all of those, GI Bill and things like that. I think of that as rooted in the 80s. And I don't think of that as the 70s. What were the signs of that during that decade?
Well, it was happening even in the 60s. During this decade of new avant-gardism, performers like the Grateful Dead and the band and Dylan and all the rest, and the Beatles with their Edwardian get-ups, were in their cutting-edge, cool way, dabbling in the past in various kinds of nostalgia. But then, starting as I track it from the appearance of the fake 50s revival act Sha Na Na at Woodstock in August of 1969, but then with Happy Days and American Graffiti and I could go on and on and on. And Bruce Springsteen, for that matter, who was kind of a high-end nostalgia act when he came along in the early 70s. That's when it started. And I spent a whole chapter going over the extent of this. And people don't remember it. So this has been a hobby horse of mine for a while, but I realized how it related to this political paradigm shift I'm talking about. I came across in the research for Evil Geniuses this extraordinary piece in the New York Times by Robert Brustein, who was then the head of the Yale Drama School, talking about this strange new plunge into nostalgia in all realms of culture and theater and television and fashion and dance. And what's that about? And is it connected to conservatism? I was happy that I had had written about my version of this before I came across, but it was like finding the Rosetta Stone. Like, it's not just me 40 years later saying this, it's this guy in the center of the culture seeing it and remarking on its weirdness in 1975.
All right, I'm going to make a big time jump because I want to talk about where we have ended up now. And you cover a lot of territory in this book. We don't have time to go into it all. But you mentioned earlier the current fear and distrust of government and the cultural stasis in this country. And you mentioned also the Koch brothers and those on the right who have enabled and encouraged that. But one of the things you write about is that it sort of can't all be blamed on them, and that even on the side of the Democrats and liberals, there's been a kind of complicity.
And mea culpa as part of that complicit pack of complacent liberals who never thought it would go where it was going. One can over-interpret or over-determine the idea of historical cycles, but I think there is a long historical cycle here from the New Deal in the 1930s to the 1970s and 80s. That was this 40, 50-year cycle where there was a consensus about what the government could do and how we were the government and we helped ourselves and we scrutinized and restrained big business and all those things and all the various ways that was done. That shifted. And many of us, me included, when I was a kid, going to college in the 70s, and I started thinking, well, liberalism is irreversible. Progress is irreversible, was at least my notion at the time. And I think that happened to a lot of us. And okay, if there's this conservative course correction that's going to happen here in the late 70s and 80s, okay, fine, we'll meet them halfway. That kind of attitude, because we're still in charge. They haven't repealed the EPA. They haven't ended Social Security or Medicare. So this habitual compromise, oh yeah, sure, we can compromise. We can find common ground with the right here, and felt free to do that because there was this kind of liberal hegemony in politics and culture and every other way. So like, oh, what's the harm? What's the harm in the 70s and 80s? And then that went on, in my view, way too long and became a kind of posture of cowering, really. And the Democratic Party and liberals in America really failed to have a distinct vision that they put forward of being different than Republicans. They became liberal Republicans effectively, and there was no longer an economic left as there had been certainly, in Roosevelt's time and afterwards, and it was institutionalized. But then it was like, no, we all agree here. We really don't disagree, do we? We affluent, liberal, and conservative bourgeoisie. And that's the problem. And that just went on too long. And in my view, thank goodness, I and others in the last decade or two have begun to wake up and see that this has not gone well because the system was changed in a way that only benefits, as we all know, and we've all heard many times, the very top economically.
A lot of people look at Clinton as, if not a turning point, because it sounds like you're saying this is really a kind of continuum and began long before that, but an intensification of that politics of compromise with his views on welfare and on criminal justice and on issues that had sort of historically been the province of conservatives that he kind of not only compromised and embraced compromise, but really advocated for those things.
And the story I tell in Evil Geniuses is that preceded him by a generation. That was already happening in the 70s with the Bill Bradleys and my friend Bob Kerrey and Paul Tsongas and Mike Dukakis and Gary Hart, all of these new Democrats in the 70s and 80s who were already effectively taking over the Democratic Party. And again, in many cases, out of earnest goodwill. Oh, there's new ways of doing this. We don't have to be stuck in the past. Let's figure out ways that are great. We can meet halfway. We can have new solutions. So, no, it preceded Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the first Democratic president of this new Democrat paradigm. And so he gets the blame, and there's some of the blame for all the good that administration did as well. But no, that's sort of my point in this book of both the right was beginning their counterattack in this full-scale class war in the early 70s, but so were the liberals and the Democrats in the 70s and 80s, way before Bill Clinton co-founded the centrist Democratic Leadership Council and before he became president. This was going on, and he was simply the full realization of, hey, we don't really disagree that all solutions to social problems are market-based. And we don't really disagree that big social programs are obsolete. That had been brewing, and Bill Clinton, just got there and was president and made that even more the programmatic idea behind the Democratic Party.
Did Obama fit right into that?
Well, Obama did not markedly change from that, alas. And I'll bet he would cop to that. I think the fact that when he became president, with continuing that and staffing his administration with people like Lawrence Summers and the Bob Rubinites and so forth, these Wall Street centric, philic people who were his economic brain trust, yeah, he stayed with it. I mean, he had other fish to fry, obviously, including a near depression that his administration had to stop from happening, and his race and everything else. So, yeah, I think on the stuff I'm talking about in Evil Geniuses, this economic paradigm shift that had happened, in 1980, he did not do much shifting. I mean, it was under in his administration that Elizabeth Warren had to sort of fight against the Obama economic brain trust to get the Financial Consumer Protection Agency created. And so more power to him, them, her for that happening. So the shift was happening, and the shift has happened, and that's good. And I think the fact that the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party is now somewhat ascendant, along with the Bernie Sanders wing, along with the Yang candidacy, I think we are talking about things, the future of automation, fairness in the society, all those things that really weren't on the table for several decades because Democrats didn't put them on the table, because they didn't have a distinct point of view about how our political economy should be and used to be, and was screwed up by the right.
And you have long established liberal credentials as one of the co-founders of Spy magazine. You were one of the eyes casting a very dark satirical eye on the decade of greed in the 80s. But you mentioned that this book is a kind of mea culpa and that your politics have changed, particularly in the last 10 years. In what ways and what sparked that?
I mean, they had been changing at the turn of the century, I would say. I drove pretty slowly on that road to Damascus to my apostasy. But in 2006, I remember, things were going great, right? The economy was rocking. Real estate was, still fantastic. It wasn't a bubble. It didn't look like a bubble yet. And I remember meeting these two airline pilots when I was home, where I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and how just ruined they felt, and what like chumps they felt, having been screwed over by United Airlines and the promises that had been made them. And it was like, whoa, what's going on here? And that's really when I began the reading and research and began slowly changing my mind from Clintonian liberal centrist, whatever, to no, this is a real problem, and it was happening before our eyes. It was a conspiracy, but unlike people imagine conspiracies, done in plain sight in 1,000 different ways. And so that really began changing my mind. And I can't look at all of the data and graph after graph after graph of what happened around 1980 as the economy continued growing, but median incomes flatlined. Productivity continued increasing, but median income flatlined. And the various kinds of insecurity and decreased economic mobility and on and on and on, all of which happened around that time and didn't just happen. It's research. I mean, I had a hunch, But then years of research filled it in and kept astonishing me. And you compare the United States to the rest of the rich world, where, of course, not of course, but inequality did increase in the end of the 20th century. But because they have a different view of what government should do and what society should be and fairness and the rest, moderated that. So it was a little bit more, the inequality increased a little bit overall, while ours was zooming up and becoming a kind of American exceptionalism of a bad kind, where this country just went out of whack and wasn't doing better. Otherwise, it wasn't as though we were growing so much better or we had such better productivity or anything else than these other rich countries. We were just dividing up the pie unfairly, and they kept dividing it fairly. So I was getting to where I got somewhat slowly for the last, 15 years, really. And then when I sat down after I'd finished Fantasyland in 2016 and started doing this reading, it was just like, good God, man, what did we let happen to this country?
The distrust and the fear of government that you describe in your book goes back, obviously, to the founding of our country. I want to talk about, though, how that has accelerated and manifested itself in our current moment. The last chapter of your book, looking at America under pandemic. And there was a great video that the opinion side of the Times put together. I don't know if you saw it, but it was of young people around the world looking at what was happening in America in the response to the coronavirus from the government and from the American people, and responding at first in laughter. And as this sort of, I think it's just a 3-minute video goes on, they end up in horror and tears. In what ways has the pandemic demonstrated your thesis here, really?
It illustrates both my thesis in my last book about crazy conspiracy theory and denial of science. So that is part of it. But it also, unfortunately, illustrates the argument in Evil Geniuses. The New York Times, in its story recently, examining why did we handle this so much worse than other rich countries. And they summarize it by saying because there is a tradition in America of prioritizing individualism over government restrictions. And number two, our political leaders, meaning Donald Trump and Republican governors, I guess, departed from expert advice significantly. Well, those two things really are just a summary of these two books, which is to say, yes, there is a tradition in America for hundreds of years of individualism. We are individualists. Good, true, great. But it had not gotten crazily politicized, weaponized, put out of control until the last few decades as part of this political project. Because the more individualism, which is to say government has no role in anything, is privileged and put up as the ultimate necessary American idea, the more business can do whatever the heck it wants. So that's how we got here. I mean, those two things, oh, yes, it's hard to make Americans behave. Sure. But it didn't become so politicized as a thing. Like, I will not wear a mask. I will not stay inside. All those things. I will not take vaccines before this. I will not allow gun regulation. All those things have been used and whipped up very deliberately, brilliantly by my evil geniuses. So yeah, I'm not denying that these things existed, but we were able as a society to use our government institutions to protect ourselves successfully. And as a collateral damage of the billionaires and big business CEOs and right-wing libertarian zealots and all the rest, I'm not saying they wanted this to happen, but what they wanted to happen, what they made happen through their various means over the last 40 and 50 years was this, by their version of libertarianism, where if you don't want to do something, by God, that's your right as an American to say you don't want to do it. The hens are coming home, or whatever that phrase is, as a result. It wasn't the intention, I don't think, to kill so far, let's say, 75,000 of our 150,000 dead from COVID on purpose, but it is a result of what the right has done.
You've given me no way of ending on a happy note.
Well, there's
Kurt.
plenty of happiness. No, there are ways out. It's hopeful.
All right. Well, I will leave that to readers to discover in the final chapters of your book. The book, again, is called Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America, A Recent History by Kurt Andersen. Kurt, Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Lesley M.M. Blume joins us now from Los Feliz, California, in Los Angeles, to talk about her new book, Fallout, the Hiroshima cover-up and the reporter who revealed it to the world. Lesley, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
This is a book, I should say, about Hiroshima by John Hersey. I think most people are probably familiar with that book, but we'll talk about it in more detail. But your subtitle refers to a cover-up, and I'm curious, let's just start there. What was the cover-up?
Well, in August of 1945, as your listeners all know, the United States decimated Hiroshima with a nearly 10,000-pound uranium bomb, which was dubbed Little Boy. And the government was almost ecstatically forthright in how they had this new experimental mega weapon. They always trotted out the coverage of it in terms of TNT. It was almost painted as a conventional mega weapon. This was the equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. And what reporters quickly picked up on was that amidst all of this outsized coverage, with pictures of landscape devastation and pictures of the mushroom clouds, that the human toll was not really being properly, if at all, reported from under those mushroom clouds in Hiroshima and then 3 days later in Nagasaki. And as it transpired, the U.S. was really doing quite an effective job of suppressing Japanese and foreign press in terms of reporting on the human toll out of fear for being seen, as former Secretary of War Henry Stimson put it, seen as outdoing Hitler in atrocities. The U.S. had just won this unqualified military victory over the Axis powers and really wanted to have their moral victory intact also. The Pacific Theater was extraordinarily painfully fought for. And, having coverage of the ghastly human toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not going to help maintain that moral victory. And so the cover-up really pertained to, in particular, to the radiological after effects of the bomb, namely that the bomb was the weapon that went on killing long after detonation.
And was John Hersey's book, which was first, of course, an issue-length article in the New Yorker, was that a kind of turning point in terms of awareness of the human toll and the reality of what that bomb wrought on Hiroshima?
Absolutely. The reality of what happened on the ground there was seen as a huge scoop for many competitive reporters who were coming in early with occupation forces. And a few people were able to get out initial alarming reports. But after that, the MacArthur occupation apparatus was able to organize quickly. And they enacted a press code, which completely suppressed the Japanese press. They weren't even allowed to mention poetry, much less a press report about radiation-induced deaths. Again, foreign reporters, the occupation press corps was brought to heel very quickly also. Hersey didn't get in until 8 or 9 months later. And at that point, the occupation press corps was really, completely suppressed. And yet Hersey managed to get into Hiroshima, do his reporting, get out, and really reveal the truth for the first time, not only to American readers, but to the world.
All right, let's talk about Hersey and who he was, what his background was. He'd been writing novels right before. He'd been a reporter, obviously, as well. But how did he get in there? And what drew him to be the one to write about this?
Well, Hersey, he's a super interesting guy. And like many reporters of his era, he was a literary reporter, meaning that he mixed up between novels and also reporting. And he was a celebrated war correspondent. He'd been covering the war for Time magazine since 1939. He'd won the Pulitzer for his 1944 war novel, A Bell for Adano. He was also a commended war hero. He had been covering a battle between the Japanese and American forces in the Solomon Islands and helped evacuate wounded Marines. So So he was an interesting candidate and probably a perfect candidate to get into occupied Japan, because if you were seen as a troublemaker, if you had been a reporter who had been butting heads with MacArthur's forces throughout the war, you were going to either not get in, or you were going to be so hindered when you got in on the ground that you wouldn't be able to travel around the country. Hersey, on the other hand, had been a perfect wartime ally reporter. I mean, he had done many glowing profiles of military figures, including General MacArthur, which was helpful in Hersey's bid to get into the country. And so, as I describe him in the book, he was really a Trojan horse of a reporter, because he's getting in under the premise that he's probably going to be an innocuous force. But then he does manage to get to Hiroshima and get his reporting about what it was like to be on the receiving end of nuclear warfare, get out of Japan, write his report back in New York. And I think occupation officials who had let him in the first place grew to regret their decision pretty quickly.
And did he go there with the backing of the New Yorker, or did he sell the piece subsequently to them?
It was conceived with the New Yorker. Hersey had actually left Time Inc. by the time he got the idea for the piece with his now editor, William Shawn, at the New Yorker. And they both realized over lunch one day when they were talking about, story ideas, that they were really disturbed by the lack of reporting, again, on the human toll in Hiroshima. And as Hersey later recounted, he said he wanted to do a story about what happened not to buildings, but what happened to human beings. And William Shawn, who's one of my favorite protagonists in the book, was known as the magazine's, quote, hunchman. And throughout the war, he had dispatched correspondents all over the globe. He didn't know exactly what the story would be. He just knew that there would be a huge one. And his judgment ended up being unerring in this case.
All right, let's talk about what he saw when he got there.
Hersey was a seasoned war correspondent. Again, he had covered the war in various theaters since 1939, and he'd seen everything from combat to concentration camps. But when he got into Hiroshima, he was astonished. And don't forget, he had to pass through Tokyo, which had been, nearly completely razed that spring by firebombing. And yet what he found on Hiroshima was just breathtaking. He had seen decimation, he had seen rubble, he had seen death. But what terrified him was that this had all been wrought by one single primitive bomb. And he really became just completely alarmed for the future of humanity in the atomic age.
So the bomb falls on August 6th, 1945. When does he get there?
He was given clearance to come in May of 1946. And then when he got on the ground in Tokyo, he was given a couple of weeks to travel to Hiroshima Prefecture and then come back. And that might sound like it's a lot of time, but it was a staggering task, because, you have to actually get down to Hiroshima from Tokyo. You have to identify blast survivors who are back living in the ruins who are going to talk to you. Hersey did not speak Japanese. He needed to find people to help him translate and also to help him make inroads within the blast survivor community. Luckily, he was able to do this, and I can't even imagine what the psychological toll must have been on him.
So I have not read Hiroshima since, I think, 9th grade in high school when it was assigned. And I don't know if it's still assigned with the same regularity. It was just one of those things you had to read along with, 1984 and the Diary of Anne Frank in terms of understanding that particular period in time. I don't know if it's still assigned to that extent, but the memory that I have of reading it, was a feeling of, you're here. This is happening right now. And yet, for us to hear about a reporter getting to the site months and months after the fact, I'm curious to hear, how did he recreate this? It felt very here and now. It felt like, he arrived on the scene.
Yeah, well, two things on that. I mean, first of all, one of the astonishing things about Hersey's report is that it came out more than a year after Hiroshima had happened. And Hiroshima was considered to be, by editors, reporters, and readers alike, a, quote, old story. Yet when people were reading it, it had the urgency of a news report. It was as if it had happened the day before. And Hersey knew that when he was writing this report that people would have a lot of incentive to ignore it or willfully not read it. First of all, because, the material was terrifying and ghastly. And, secondly, because it was going to confront a lot of Americans for the first time with the reality of what their experimental megaweapon had done to a largely civilian population. It's been estimated that around 90% of those killed in Hiroshima were civilians. So the way that he created that feeling, for him, he had to create something novelistic and unput-downable. The only way he was going to get people to be engrossed by it. So he created it in sort of a novel structure where he picked 6 protagonists who, I mean, everybody who he interviewed had equally, horrifically compelling stories. But these people who he picked had all their lives overlapped in real life, and then they all overlapped on the day of August 6, 1945, and in the days afterwards. And so he was able to create this sort of cliffhanging narrative among all of those testimonies. And it is one of the most transporting works I have ever read. And, I even when I glance at the pages now, and obviously I've been very immersed in this work for a few years, I mean, you're instantly back again. And, Hersey's idea was that he wanted his readers to experience the event with these 6 protagonists, because he felt if he could create a sense of empathy, it would dehumanize the Japanese to Americans. And he really truly felt that the only chance that humanity had to survive in the atomic age, again, was if humans started to see the humanity in one another again.
What was the public and critical reception at the time of publication? I mean, was this immediately seen as this kind of really important monumental work?
Yes, absolutely. Hersey later said that the immediate response was explosive, which isn't a word that I would use.
Yeah, and, a little unfortunate choice of words.
Yeah, but the sentiment was accurate. And I have to say, look, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the public was going to be receptive to this. I mean, the American public was incredibly angry about Pearl Harbor and horrified by revelations about, Japanese atrocities in Nanking and Manila and throughout China. And, they had horrifically bloody time with this adversary in the Pacific, even just from a little bit of the blowback that I've been getting 75 years later in telling the story, that, the Japanese deserved it. Harry Truman said in his speech announcing the bomb, the Japanese have been repaid manyfold. So given that mindset, the reaction to Hersey's Hiroshima was astonishing. A survey at the time said that it was a work that had been really promoted the common good, and that it had opened up people's eyes to not just what had happened specifically in Hiroshima, but the danger that human civilization now faced. The story, which is some 31,000 words, which, as you know, is an incredibly long story for a news magazine, was syndicated in its entirety in newspapers around the world. It was read in its entirety in 4 consecutive nights on ABC and then the BBC. It was covered on more than 500 radio stations in the US alone. It was more or less immediately made into a book. And, editions of it were released, I think 22 editions or something like that within the first year, which is, again, as you know, is a pretty astonishing development. The influence was outsized and total. And, many, many people for the first time really were understanding the weapons that had been developed in secret and detonated in their names.
Your first book about a book was also a book about war. You previously wrote about Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. Did you finish that and think, I like doing this. I'm going to find another book about war, and I'm going to do, they're very different books, but I'm going to do this again from this angle?
Yeah, I'm such a cliche of myself. I have to say, I kind of wish that it hadn't shaken out that way, because it's not like I really want to make an extensive career out of documenting the evolution of these great works. But, in this case, what I really wanted to do with Fallout is I knew before I even had this topic that I wanted to do a big historical nonfiction narrative on a historical newsroom story, because I've been personally very upset, as an understatement, about the unprecedented assaults on our free press in this country over the last 4 years. And I really needed to find a historical newsroom narrative that drove home the extremity of the importance of investigative reporting, holding the powerful to account, and giving a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. And I looked at many different narratives, most of them in the World War II period, because I just have an affinity academically and for that period. And Hersey's story found me as much as I found it. And it was the purest example of crucial investigative reporting as I could find. And it, to this day, it's regularly cited as the most influential piece of written investigative journalism ever created.
Well, the crisis around the First Amendment and news and investigative reporting and news deserts and freedom of speech and all of that obviously is one that's close to my heart as a journalist. But there are so many crises right now between climate and the pandemic and the economy. I'm interested to know if working on this book created a greater sense of urgency around another crisis that sort of waxes and wanes in popular imagination or awareness, which is nuclear war. I mean, did you end this thinking, oh, actually, we should be more scared about this, more aware of this than we are?
Absolutely. And I don't, the public's bandwidth right now to stare down another existential crisis is probably pretty thin. And in some respects, it's almost we're in a similar environment to 1945 and 1946, where, the American public was just exhausted by what I call atrocity fatigue, except this is different. We're exhausted for different reasons. But the fact is that, when the pandemic has been quelled, we are staring down, a terrific existential threat with nuclear. The nuclear landscape, and the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists has designated our current landscape as being the most dangerous ever. And that includes even more dangerous than 1953, the depths of the Cold War, when thermonuclear weapons were first detonated. This country is about to commit to a $1.7 trillion program in new nuclear arms development. I believe that we're only in one international treaty now of arms control. It's an extremely alarming environment. And, even though I entered into this project really as a defense of 1A of First Amendment and reminding readers of how, deadly important our free press is to upholding our democracy, helping to uphold our democracy, I will never now not be or attempt to be an asset to advocates who are trying to raise awareness around nuclear issues, because it is going to be something that we can't be surprised by it when we come out of our current crisis. We have to be prepared to grapple with it. And it also needs to be an election issue going into this fall.
Well, a fine example, again, to go to your original intent on highlighting the importance of the First Amendment and investigative reporting. The book, again, is called Fallout, The Hiroshima Cover-Up and the Reporter Who Revealed It to the World by Lesley M.M. Blume. Lesley, thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
How's this week been and what's going on?
So there is really good news and then kind of bad news, and they're closely related, which is pretty interesting. There's been a huge spike in demand for print books from readers, and sales are up despite, as we've talked about, the challenges of the shutdown and the pandemic. But at the same time, print capacity has been a real challenge for publishers. And now they're facing a really crowded fall season. A lot of the books that were postponed in the spring and early summer were pushed back to fall. And those books are colliding with long planned big releases. And publishers are just having a hard time getting enough copies printed, and books that have sold so far beyond anyone's expectations, books like The Mary Trump, the Stephanie Meyer, which was sort of a surprise, not a surprise hit, but it was announced and then quickly released. John Bolton, Suzanne Collins, the Hunger Games author, all those books have sold more than 1 million copies. And so now you're seeing publishers having to take these books that they've already moved back to the fall and push them further out. Some of them are going into next year. And for a business that really is carefully calibrated for release dates, publishers are always thinking about when they can get media attention, and they don't want all the big books to come out the same week because it detracts from the attention they can get. They're really having to scramble. So on the one hand, great news that readers are buying so many books and print sales are up, but real challenges on the supply chain side.
You and I are talking here on August 27th. There were about 15 major books that came out on the 25th of August earlier this week. that's unusual. Like this used to be kind of the dead zone. And I remember we were looking at the books to sort of watch for in September, which is a story we put up each month for upcoming releases. And we just could not cut it down. There are just so many big books coming out. You have to wonder, how are they all going to get attention? There's like 10 things I want to read right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great problem to have if you are looking for great books to read. But, it's such a change from the thinking last year when publishers were looking ahead to 2020 and the election, and everyone was saying, you can't publish in the fall. The country's going to be glued to the political drama. We need to avoid late fall. And now everything's coming out at once. So it is pretty interesting. And at the same time, brick and mortar retail has recovered somewhat from the earlier days of the pandemic when a lot of stores were closed, but bookstores are still really struggling. So when there is a delay at the printer, it kind of ripples through the whole publishing ecosystem. So if bookstores can't get the copies in time that readers are ordering, readers may try to find it somewhere else, find it online, or buy something else. And so, especially for authors whose books are selling well, it can be a really frustrating problem.
All right, here's what I want to know. I know that you are looking forward to reading Kazuo Ishiguro's next book, but that's not until the spring. What are you most looking forward to this fall?
Well, I haven't read the new Elena Ferrante yet, and it's gotten a tremendous review from Parl Sagal and a really interesting profile of her translator. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. I'm interested in Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar. I liked his earlier work, and there are just so many books coming out. There's a new Marilyn Robinson. I'm probably going to have to just take a couple of weeks off to read. I hope that's okay.
Yes, we're allowed to take reading vacations here. Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and Noor Qasim. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, Greg, let's start with you. What are you reading this week?
I'm reading Maggie O'Farrell's new novel, Hamnet, which, as readers of Geraldine Brooks's very favorable cover review in the book review will know, is about Shakespeare's family. It's subtitled A Novel of the Plague, which tells you in some ways how timely it is. It is a novel about Shakespeare's family and specifically the death of his son, Hamnet. You ask what I've been reading this week. The truth is, it's a little bit of a shameful truth. I've been reading it for like a month now. One thing about the pandemic is, as happy as I am not to be commuting anymore, I used my commuting time to read, and now I use my commuting time to walk. And so it's cut into my reading time a lot. And I find I'm just reading like a couple of pages before bed every night. And so things are taking me much longer. And this has been a long read for me, but not because it's a slog of a book at all. To the contrary, it is completely immersive. It is a book that gets deep into the domestic realm of Shakespeare's world. It brings impressive light to bear on the unacknowledged hard work of women in maintaining order in that world. I say it's about Shakespeare's family, but really Shakespeare himself is kind of a sidelined character in it. It's very much a book about Shakespeare's wife, Agnes, and her relationship to the family. One thing that I really love about Agnes as a character is that she demonstrates this satisfying display of competence and knowledge in a way that I always respond to, whether it's coming from MacGyver or from Agnes Shakespeare. It's this familiarity with the natural world and this intuition and adaptability. She collects roots. She keeps bees. When we meet her, she has a hunting kestrel as a pet. There's like almost a touch of the shaman to her. And the book feels, like I said, incredibly timely. It's a novel of the plague. There's this running sense of kind of dread and fear of this disease nobody understands, the measures that might keep us safe, whether it's quarantine or masks or medicine. There's this debate about what you need to do to avoid the plague. For the last week while I was reading it, for almost a week, I had no electricity at my house. So cooking by fire, all the things that you read about in this book. One effect of the book was to underline how much continuity there is between different historical eras. O'Farrell makes just the clearly deliberate and inspired choice to sideline Shakespeare as a character. He's there, but she never names him. Interestingly, it becomes kind of a running joke. He's always just the husband or the brother or the glovemaker's son. And so it's about Agnes, and through her, it's a novel about a certain kind of remarkable, capable woman carving out her own place in a world where that's not easy or expected.
Have you read her previous books?
I have not. I've heard good things about her memoir, I Am, which was framed around a series of near-death experiences that she had, places where she might have died but didn't. But I have not read that book, and I had not heard of her before that book. So this is my introduction to her. Nora, what are you reading?
So I am reading Mating, which is Norman Rush's first novel, for which he won the National Book Award. And I'd never read him before, but way back at the beginning of March, my aunt had kind of put it in my hands and told me I must read. So it's been kind of just sitting at the top of my pile for the past few months as I've been flitting around and reading a lot of shorter things. But then last week I picked it up because I wanted something, meaty and long that I could just sink my teeth into. And it's definitely been that. I'm only 150 pages in of 500 so far, but I'm really enjoying it. And basically it's about this. The narrator is an unnamed anthropologist working in Botswana, and she kind of abandons her project. It's not working out, but then embarks on these series of romantic entanglements and ends up pursuing this man, this very popular intellectual called Nelson Janoon, who is forming this sort of utopic community in the middle of the Kalahari. So I have a lot more to read, but this narrator is just amazing and so astute and funny and uses a lot of words that I have never encountered. So it's been a real intellectual and emotional journey so far.
Are you reading it with a dictionary at your side?
I definitely should be. There are so many words that I am also kind of doing the bedtime reading because, I'm just walking a lot more to clear my mind. So it's not always the most relaxing to have to look up kind of every other word I encounter, but I'm definitely learning some new ones. So
we should let our listeners know, since Nora is a new voice to the podcast, that she is also somewhat new to our desk. She is our fellow for this year and has been thrust into our archives as part of a big project. So I imagine the walking to clear your head thing probably has a lot to do with like the state of the world, but I feel also we're probably a little bit responsible for here at the Book Review.
I don't know about that, but it certainly is when you're spending all day combing through all of our archival issues. It's nice to kind of just look at the world around you.
Pamela, what are you reading?
I spoke last week about Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police, and the book I want to talk about this week is Lydia Millett's A Children's Bible, and I read them back to back, and they are both kind of very dark dystopian books that I really appreciated after having read them and didn't so much enjoy the reading experience itself, which I think is really no fault of these books, but more a fault of the world at large, which is to say, I have no appetite right now for reading very dark things about the end of the world and ominous futures, because I feel immersed in that already. I have more enjoyed during the last few months reading books that have nothing whatsoever to do with the current state of the planet. If all the books I could read take place on a fictional planet in a universe in a galaxy very far away, I'd be happy. But it's a really good book, I should say, in its favor, as was The Memory Police, which I really thought was excellent. This book is a slender novel. Lydia was on the podcast earlier this pandemic to talk about it, and she's been on the podcast before. It's a kind of allegorical novel that, as you can tell from the title, sort of mirrors a children's Bible. And I have to say, I had some trepidation in approaching this novel because I am biblically illiterate. I did have a children's Bible, but essentially once it got to Cain and Abel, I was out. I really enjoyed the flood, and I liked, the Garden of Eden. I mean, liked it as one does a good mythological tale, which is how I read them, having really grown up in a not religious household. But then once it got to like the slaying of brothers, as much as I had those urges towards my own brothers at certain points in my childhood, I was kind of done with the Bible. So a lot of this, I think, really did go over my head. There was a class in college that I always meant to take, which was the Bible as literature, but it was at 9 a.m. And I had sort of decided it's like now I look back at these decisions one makes when you're a student, and I can't imagine, it's hard to fathom the depths of my stupidity. But in my mind at the time, like 9 a.m. was just not a class you had to take as a college student. So I never took that class. And so a lot of this, as I said, I think goes over my head, but it's a really interesting and ambitious book. It takes place in a kind of unnamed vacation area. I think, I pictured it as somewhere upstate New York where a group of families and their children have retreated for an extended vacation. And then the end of the world basically happens in a series of kind of biblical cataclysmic events, from storms to, plague. There we are again, to violence in the streets. And it's told from the perspective of the children. It's a really great book. I don't know if I'm selling it here, but she's doing a lot of things and I think pulls it off very well.
I've read maybe the first 50 pages of it. It starts out as this kind of Garden of Eden, all these families together at this summer house. And the kids are separated from the parents kind of generationally. I mean, just off. It's almost like the Peanuts characters where the parents don't matter.
Wah, 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 wah.
and so there was something that felt like the Boxcar Children or something about it to me. I love Lydia Millet's writing. I find her often very funny in a kind of sly way going on underneath what's going on in the story. And so I will certainly finish this book, but I set it aside about 50 pages in and I haven't gone back to it yet.
Nora, have you read any Lydia Millet?
I have not, but I'm definitely intrigued. I'm also a Bible illiterate, but I hope to, repair that at some point. So this might be a good starting point.
This would be a really fun way to learn the Bible, Nora. I think if Lydia Millet heard that you were going to get your biblical education through this book, I think she'd probably be profoundly pleased.
I took a Bible as literature class in high school. I went to an Episcopal school, and so we had a required Bible class that really approached it as literature and history, not literal history, but kind of reading it through that lens. And I have to say, you missed something by skipping a class at 9 a.m. It has colored a lot of my reading, since you realize how much the Bible is kind of everywhere in our culture and in our literature.
Yes, I am aware. I'm well aware of my intellectual deficits here. One day I will take that class. For now, Lydia Millet is my biblical guide. All right, let's run down the titles of the books that we read. Greg, starting with you.
I'm reading Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell.
I'm reading Mating by Norman Rush.
And I just finished reading A Children's Bible by Lydia Millet. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.